Before he became a legend, most thought he was the wrong man to lead. In the sweltering halls of Philadelphia, the delegates of the Continental Congress debated not only rebellion, but the impossible who among them could command an army that did not yet exist. The British Empire was the most powerful force on earth, its soldiers trained, its ships unstoppable. The men in that room were lawyers, planters, philosophers, patriots, perhaps, but not soldiers. When George Washington stood, tall and solemn in his faded uniform from a forgotten war, few could have guessed that the fate of the Revolution had just found its most unlikely guardian. It was June of 1775, and America was still an idea more than a country. Outside the city, farmers with muskets gathered under banners that barely held together in the wind, calling themselves the Continental Army. Inside, politics simmered. John Adams rose to nominate Washington, not because he was the greatest general, but because he was a Virginian, a gesture to unite the northern and southern colonies. As Adams spoke, Washington sat silently, his face a mask of humility and worry. He had not asked for command. In truth, he feared it. The vote was swift and unanimous. Washington accepted the post with quiet gravity, promising to serve without pay. Yet beneath his composure, he was tormented by doubt. He knew the truth the Congress dared not say aloud. The colonies were unprepared for war. Their soldiers were undisciplined, their supply lines non-existent, their courage untested. He had seen what British firepower could do, and he understood the cost of pride. Still, he buttoned his blue coat, mounted his horse, and rode north to meet his army, an army of strangers and dreamers. When he arrived outside Boston, the sight nearly broke him. Men without shoes, rifles without powder, tents made of rags. Disease spread faster than orders. Officers argued, soldiers deserted, and rumor whispered that even God had turned his back on the cause. Washington wrote to Congress that his troops were the most disorderly set of men I ever saw. Yet he did not give up. He walked among them, learned their names, and gave them what they needed most, not weapons, but purpose. There were moments, in the dead of night, when even he wondered if the dream was too fragile to survive. He was a man caught between history and failure, aware that one defeat could end the revolution before it truly began. But it was in that doubt that his greatness began to form not in victory, but in endurance. The revolution did not begin with glory. It began with hesitation, fear, and a man in an old uniform who carried the burden of a nation's hope. George Washington did not seek greatness. He merely refused to turn away from duty. And in that quiet resolve, the first threads of America's destiny began to take shape not in triumph, but in the fragile courage to lead when no one believed it could be done. They thought the war would be over by Christmas. They were wrong. In the summer of 1775, the air in the colonies was thick with conviction and naivety. Young men marched through town squares with muskets on their shoulders and fire in their hearts. Women sewed flags, blacksmiths hammered swords, and ministers thundered from pulpits that God himself had chosen America for liberty. The dream of independence glowed bright, but it was a fire that no one yet knew how to control. From his camp outside Boston, Washington watched the raw enthusiasm of his army with both pride and dread. The men called him His Excellency, with reverence, but few could follow an order without argument. Farmers and shopkeepers drilled with sticks in place of bayonets, their laughter echoing between the hills. They came to fight tyranny, not to live by discipline. Their courage was undeniable, but courage alone could not feed an army, nor stand against Britain's cannons. Washington spent his days inspecting the lines, his nights writing desperate letters for powder, shoes, and medicine. "We are now," he warned Congress, "at the point of starvation." The men believed they would face a handful of redcoats and go home heroes. Washington knew better. The British Army was not a rumour, it was a machine. Trained soldiers with gleaming muskets, drilled to perfection, commanded by generals who had crushed empires long before America dared to dream of freedom. Still, he trained them. He barked orders until his voice cracked, punished deserters with the lash, and built from chaos something that faintly resembled an army. At dawn, the hills echoed with drumbeats instead of hymns. The smell of powder and sweat filled the camps. Slowly, painfully, the dreamers began to harden into soldiers. Yet every improvement came at a price. Men who had never left their farms now watched their friends die of fever before firing a shot. The ideals they had carried with them began to wilt under the sun of reality. Then came news that chilled even Washington's resolve. A British fleet had been spotted off New York, its masts blotting out the horizon. An invasion force unlike anything the colonies had ever faced was on its way. The dream of a short, glorious war began to dissolve into dread. Washington stared at the sea and knew that the real fight had not even begun. Optimism faded, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than defeat. The soldiers still cheered when he rode past, but their eyes had changed. They now looked to him not as a symbol, but as a shield. Freedom, they were beginning to understand, would not come wrapped in glory. It would come through hunger, fear, and the long, uncertain road ahead. The revolution was still young, but its innocence was already dying. His first battle was not against the British, but against despair. When George Washington took command of the Continental Army outside Boston in the summer of 1775, he found not an army, but a mob with muskets. Men lounged in camps without uniforms, gambling, drinking, and arguing over who should stand guard. Powder was scarce, disease was rampant, and the smell of filth hung over the trenches like a curse. The city of Boston lay ahead, occupied by British troops and surrounded by cannon. But the greater threat lay within. Hunger, impatience, and doubt is less than #0. 9# is greater than. The siege was a waiting game, and Washington hated waiting. He had marched north expecting battle, only to find that the enemy refused to leave the safety of its ships and fortifications. Every morning he rose before dawn to inspect the lines, ragged men clutching rusted muskets, their feet bare, their spirits thin. His letters to Congress grew desperate. "I find myself already in want of everything," he wrote, pleading for powder, tents, and medicine. Yet Congress sent words instead of supplies, praise instead of powder. Washington began to learn the loneliness of command. Inside the city, the British watched and waited, confident that the rebel army would crumble on its own. Outside the walls, disease stalked the camps like a phantom. Smallpox, dysentery, and hunger claimed men faster than musket fire. Washington ordered the camps cleaned, the sick quarantined, the discipline enforced with unflinching severity. Some called him cruel, others feared him. But slowly, under the weight of his will, order began to form from chaos. The soldiers who once called him that Virginian began to salute him with respect, not because he inspired them, but because he endured when others faltered. As winter crept in, the siege dragged on without victory or glory. Washington's frustration deepened. Every report from his officers confirmed what he already knew. Without ammunition, they could not attack. Without victory, they could not survive. Yet to act rashly would mean destruction. His instincts as a soldier demanded action. His duty as a leader demanded restraint. For the first time, Washington learned that courage was not only the charge of battle, it was the strength to wait for the right moment. That moment came when Henry Knox, a bookseller turned artilleryman, arrived dragging 60 tons of cannon from Fort Ticonderoga through snow and wilderness. Washington seized the opportunity. Under cover of night, the guns were mounted on Dorchester Heights overlooking the city. When the sun rose, the British awoke to find themselves trapped. Their ships turned toward the harbour, and without a shot, they evacuated Boston. The city was free, and the Continental Army, at last, had a victory. Washington's triumph was not in conquest, but in control. He had won his first battle by mastering his own fear, his army's chaos, and the Congress's impatience. In the silence after the British retreat, he realized something profound. Leadership was not glory, it was endurance, and in that hard winter outside Boston, he discovered that sometimes the greatest victories are the ones bought with restraint, not blood. He lost his city, and nearly his soul. The summer of 1776 burned bright with hope, but by its end, the revolution teetered on the edge of ruin. The Declaration of Independence had just been signed, its words still ringing with defiance, when the British returned to reclaim their empire. Their fleet filled the horizon, hundreds of sails glinting like knives in the sun, the greatest armada ever sent across the Atlantic. To the men in Washington's army, it looked less like war and more like judgment. New York was the prize, and Washington knew it. Whoever controlled its harbor would control the gateway to the colonies. But his army was raw, his officers inexperienced, and his defenses spread too thin. He built forts on both Manhattan and Long Island, hoping courage could make up for what they lacked in numbers. Congress urged him to stand and fight, believing the same spirit that freed Boston could save New York. Washington obeyed, though in his heart he already knew the truth. The attack came swift and merciless. On the morning of August 27th, the British landed on Long Island, advancing through fog and forest. Their ranks moved like a machine, bayonets flashing, drums beating steady as thunder. Washington's lines crumbled. Men fired once and fled. Some drowned trying to swim the river, others threw down their muskets and begged for mercy. Watching from across the water, Washington gripped his spyglass and felt the world collapse inside him. "Good God," he whispered, "what brave fellows I must lose this day." When the survivors staggered back to Manhattan, their faces were pale with defeat. The revolution's dream of glory drowned in the mud of Long Island. For 3 days, Washington paced his tent, haunted by guilt. He blamed himself for his pride, his misjudgment, his hesitation. In those dark hours, he came close to despair. But even as the British closed in, something inside him hardened. Failure, he decided, was not an ending unless he allowed it to be. That night, with the enemy surrounding him, Washington ordered a retreat that would become legend. Under cover of fog and silence, he ferried his entire army, thousands of men, horses, and cannon across the East River to safety. When the mist lifted at dawn, the British stared in disbelief. The rebels were gone, every man accounted for. It was not a victory, but it was survival. And survival, in that moment, was enough. Yet the cost was heavy. New York fell, the Continental Army fled south, and the myth of Washington's invincibility shattered. The press turned on him, Congress wavered, and soldiers whispered that perhaps the revolution had been doomed from the start. But history would remember that night on the East River when a defeated general refused to surrender to despair. The revolution had lost its city, but it had not yet lost its soul. In one night of fog and silence, he saved the revolution. The Battle of Long Island had turned into catastrophe. Washington's army was cornered, 10,000 men pinned between the British on the hills and the deep waters of the East River behind them. The redcoats waited for dawn to deliver the final blow. Cannon muzzles glimmered on the ridges, their crews ready to erase the rebellion in a single morning. In the darkness, Washington paced the shoreline, his boots sinking into the mud, his mind clawing for a miracle. The night air was heavy and cold. Across the river, the faint glow of Manhattan shimmered like a promise he might never reach. Around him, soldiers whispered prayers. Their nerves stretched thin after days of fighting and retreat. There were no cheers, no speeches, no talk of liberty, only exhaustion and fear. Washington knew that if his army fell, the revolution would die with it. His only choice was escape. It was not glorious, it was not heroic, but it was the only path left. Quietly, he summoned his officers. Every boat within miles, fishing skiffs, rowboats, barges, was to be gathered under cover of night. The men would cross the river in silence, leaving fires burning to trick the British into thinking they still held the lines. One misstep, one gunshot, one flicker of panic, and it would all be over. As midnight fell, the evacuation began. The first regiments moved through the fog, oars dipping without sound, the black water swallowing them whole. Hour after hour, the river became a highway of ghosts. Horses, cannon, and men vanished into the mist, ferried from one shore to the other. Washington rode up and down the bank, his face pale in the lantern light, refusing to rest until every soldier was safe. At one point, he stopped to help push a boat from the shallows, his hands numb with cold. When an officer urged him to cross to safety, he shook his head. "I shall not leave until the army does." By dawn, the last boats were still loading, and then, as if by divine mercy, a dense fog rolled in from the sea. It blanketed the river so completely that even the nearest shore vanished from sight. The British, waiting for daylight to strike, saw nothing but grey. When the sun finally broke through, Washington's camp was empty. The army had disappeared, leaving only footprints and ashes behind. The impossible had happened. They had escaped. As his men collapsed in exhaustion on the Manhattan shore, Washington stood at the water's edge, staring back into the mist. He knew the victory was not his, it belonged to chance, to courage, to providence, but it had given the revolution one more breath. From that night on, Washington understood what kind of war he was fighting. It would not be won through glory or conquest, but through survival, one narrow escape at a time, and as long as his army lived, the dream of freedom would not die. Every mile was a defeat measured in footsteps. After the fall of New York, the British swept across New Jersey like a storm, and Washington's army, broken, starving, and exhausted, became a shadow fleeing its own failure. The cold wind off the Hudson bit through tattered uniforms as the ragged column trudged south, muskets slung low, their footprints filling with ice. Behind them, British drums echoed through the empty countryside. Ahead lay only uncertainty and the faint hope that the Delaware River might still offer escape. The retreat was not a march, but a slow unravelling. Towns that once cheered for liberty now shut their doors in silence. Farmers hid their food, fearing British reprisals. Each morning, the army woke smaller than before, another man deserted, another died of fever or frostbite. Washington rode at the head of the column, his face carved with exhaustion. He said little, but the weight of the nation's failure pressed visibly on his shoulders. Even his officers, once bold and loyal, began to whisper that perhaps the cause had already been lost. The British pursuit was relentless. General Cornwallis moved swiftly, confident the rebellion was collapsing before his eyes. His troops marched with boots and supplies, their discipline unbroken, while Washington's men stumbled barefoot over frozen mud. When they passed through Newark, the general paused to look back red-coated ranks glinting in the distance and muttered to an aide, "The game is nearly up." It was not despair in his voice, but grim realism. The revolution, it seemed, was bleeding out before it had even begun. Rain turned to sleet, and sleet to snow. Muskets froze, wheels shattered, and men wrapped their hands in rags to keep them from splitting open. Washington refused to abandon them. He rode among the ranks, silent but steady, sharing what little food he had. To the men who remained, that quiet endurance became its own kind of courage. They followed not out of belief in victory, but because he still rode forward when every reason said to stop. By early December, the army had dwindled to a few thousand half-starved souls. They crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, their retreat complete, their spirits broken. Washington stood on the far bank, watching the last boat pull away under the grey sky. His army was on the edge of collapse, the enlistments of his men about to expire at the end of the year. There were no reinforcements coming, no supplies, no miracles, only the cold and the choice to go on. That night, in a dim tent lit by a single candle, Washington bowed his head over a map of the colonies and made a decision that would define him. He could not command victory, not yet, but he could command faith. If the army was gone, then faith itself would have to fight on in its place. "We must make the best of mankind as they are," he wrote, "and those who remain must act." It was not strategy that saved him in that winter of defeat. It was belief fragile, desperate, and unbroken. He needed information and got a martyr. After the fall of New York, Washington was blind. His scouts were scattered, his maps outdated, his army on the run. Every move he made seemed to play into British hands, as if the enemy could read his thoughts. "We are fighting shadows," one officer said bitterly, and Washington knew it was true. To win, he needed eyes behind the British lines, men who could risk everything not with a musket, but with a lie. Thus began America's first, fragile steps into the dark art of espionage. One volunteer came forward, Nathan Hale, a 21-year-old schoolteacher from Connecticut. Idealistic, handsome, and burning with patriotic fervor, Hale had never seen real battle. When Washington called for someone to slip into New York disguised as a loyalist, Hale answered without hesitation. Friends tried to dissuade him, spies were not soldiers, and if caught, death would not come with honor. But Hale only smiled and said, "Every kind of service necessary for the public good becomes honorable by being necessary." It was the purest kind of bravery and perhaps the most dangerous. He crossed the lines alone, carrying false papers and a new name. For days he moved quietly through the occupied city, taking notes on troop movements, supply depots, and British defences. But New York was crawling with informants. The British commander, General Howe, had eyes in every tavern and ear on every dock. Within a week, Hale's disguise unravelled. A loyalist recognised him, and soldiers surrounded him before he could flee. He was taken to Howe's headquarters, interrogated, and condemned without trial. The sentence was death by hanging at dawn. On the morning of his execution, Hale stood beneath the gallows alone, calm and unshaken. The sun was just rising over the harbour, glinting off the masts of British ships. When asked for his final words, he looked to the crowd and spoke softly. "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." The rope tightened, and a life of promise ended before it had begun. His body was left hanging as a warning to others who might dare to follow. When word of Hale's death reached Washington, he said nothing at first. Those who saw him that day remembered the silence, the tightening of his jaw, the brief lowering of his eyes. The loss was more than personal. It was a lesson written in blood. Washington realized that courage alone could not win this war. Information was power, and power demanded secrecy, cunning, and sacrifice. He would never again send a man to spy without the means to survive. From Hale's doomed mission, something vital was born. Washington began to weave a network of informants and couriers, men and women hidden in plain sight, an invisible army fighting a silent war. Hale's death had not been in vain. It had opened the general's eyes to the battlefield no one could see. From failure and sacrifice, Washington learned the value of deception and the price of freedom in the shadows. On Christmas night, he gambled everything, and history held its breath. The year 1776 was dying, and with it, the Revolution. Washington's army had shrunk to a few thousand starving, half-naked men. Their enlistments were about to expire, their spirits crushed by defeat after defeat. Snow covered the fields of Pennsylvania, and across the icy Delaware River, a garrison of Hessian mercenaries slept soundly in the town of Trenton. To most, the war was over. To Washington, it was not yet lost, not while he still drew breath. He gathered his officers on the night before Christmas. By candlelight, he unfolded his plan, a desperate crossing of the frozen river under cover of darkness, followed by a surprise attack before dawn. It was madness. The storm was worsening, the river choked with ice, and the enemy rested just a few miles away. Yet Washington's voice did not waver. "Victory or death," he said quietly. There was no strategy left, only resolve, and that was enough to make men follow him into the dark. The march began in silence. The wind howled off the river, cutting through threadbare coats and numbing fingers. Ice cracked beneath the boots of the soldiers as they pushed the heavy cannon toward the shore. When the boats finally shoved off, the river swallowed them, whole waves slapping, snow stinging their faces, oars freezing to their hands. Washington stood at the bow of one boat, his greatcoat whipping in the wind, a solitary figure framed against the storm. In the faint moonlight, his men saw not a general, but a man who refused to break. Hours passed before they reached the opposite shore. The storm had worsened. Dawn was already approaching. Some men collapsed on the banks, unable to move. Yet Washington urged them on. They marched through sleet and darkness, their muskets soaked, their footsteps muffled by snow. Somewhere ahead lay Trenton and the chance to revive a dying revolution. When they reached the outskirts of town, Washington raised his sword and whispered, "Forward." Then the stillness shattered with the thunder of muskets and cannon. The Hessians, caught in their sleep, stumbled into the streets in confusion. Within an hour, it was over. Nearly 1,000 prisoners were taken. Not one American was lost in battle. It was a small victory by military measure, but to the men who had known only defeat, it was resurrection. As the smoke cleared, soldiers wept openly, shouting, "Long live the general! Long live the Republic!" Washington dismounted, walked among his men, and for the first time in months, allowed himself a faint, tired smile. By the time the sun rose over the Delaware, the revolution had been reborn. It was not strategy that had saved it, but faith, the faith of men who followed one leader through storm and darkness because he refused to surrender. That night, on the edge of oblivion, Washington had wagered everything. And in the still, frozen dawn at Trenton, America took its first breath of victory. A bullet missed him by inches, history didn't. The victory at Trenton had breathed life back into the revolution, but Washington knew one victory would not be enough to save it. The British, furious and humiliated, were already marching to crush him. Snow and smoke still hung in the air when he made his next gamble, to turn and strike again, this time at Princeton. His officers warned him it was madness, the army was exhausted, their powder soaked, their rations gone. Washington simply looked up from his map and said, "We must conquer, or die." The night march began under a moonless sky. Men stumbled along frozen roads, their breath rising in clouds. Cannon wheels creaked like cries in the cold. At dawn, they encountered British regulars advancing toward them, veterans in scarlet coats who moved like iron. The first American line broke almost instantly. Muskets cracked, smoke filled the air, and soldiers fled into the woods, panic threatening to devour them all. The battle teetered on collapse, another retreat, another ruin, and then, through the chaos, Washington appeared on horseback. He rode straight into the smoke, his white horse shining ghost-like through the gunfire. "Parade with me, my brave fellows," he shouted, waving his sword above the din. Men turned, stunned not at his words, but at the sight of him advancing toward the enemy. Musket balls whistled past his coat, one tore through his sleeve. For a heartbeat, the field went silent, every soldier, British and American, watching to see if the general would fall. Then Washington wheeled his horse, pointed his blade and roared, "Charge!" The line surged forward. The volley that followed tore through the British ranks, scattering them in confusion. In minutes, the redcoats were retreating. Smoke rolled across the field as Washington's men pressed on, shouting his name. When the firing finally stopped, the snow was stained red. But the impossible had happened. The British had been driven from Princeton. Washington sat astride his horse, calm amid the wreckage, as if he'd just stared death in the face and found it wanting. An officer later said, "I expected every moment to see him fall." He seemed to court fate. For the first time, his soldiers no longer saw a man of marble ideals, but a mortal who shared their fear and faced it anyway. In the smoke of Princeton, Washington's legend was born not from victory alone, but from the courage to ride toward the fire when all others ran from it. The myth of invincibility that had been shattered in New York was rebuilt that morning, not by luck, but by will. When the sun broke through the grey, Washington looked across the silent field and whispered to an aide, "It is a fine morning." It was more than a remark. It was a rebirth. The army that had stumbled through defeat now stood tall again, believing not in the promise of easy triumph, but in the man who refused to die. The revolution would live because he did. Freedom froze in its cradle. The winter of 1777 was not a season, it was a sentence. The Continental Army staggered into Valley Forge, hungry, barefoot, and broken from another year of fighting. Snow fell thick across the Pennsylvania hills, muffling the groans of men building huts from rotted logs. Smoke from green wood burned their eyes. The smell of sickness and unwashed bodies hung heavy over the camp. The British occupied Philadelphia just 20 miles away, warm and fed, while Washington's army starved within sight of their fires. The men wrapped rags around their feet to keep them from freezing. Some left bloody footprints on the snow, staining the whiteness with the color of sacrifice. Rations ran out, then hope began to follow. "We are without clothes, without provisions," one soldier wrote. "We are almost naked, starving." Washington moved among them silently, the tall figure on horseback, his face drawn and pale with worry. He could offer no comfort but presence. In his tent, he prayed for bread and begged Congress for supplies, but politics in Philadelphia moved slower than hunger. Disease spread through the camp: smallpox, dysentery, fever. Men shivered under thin blankets and whispered homeward prayers. Desertion seemed easier than death. Some cursed the revolution entirely, muttering that liberty was not worth starvation. Washington heard them, and though anger flickered in his heart, he did not punish them. He knew that punishment could not feed the starving or warm the frozen. His strength, in those days, was not in his orders, it was in his endurance. In February, salvation arrived from an unexpected source. A Prussian officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben. Stern, loud, and relentless, he brought with him something Washington's army had never known: discipline. In the snow and mud, he drilled them day after day, teaching them how to march, load, and fight like a true army. "Again! Again!" he bellowed as men stumbled through maneuvers. They cursed him at first, but soon their muskets fired in unison. Their steps fell in rhythm. From suffering, order began to form. By spring, the camp had transformed. The men who had once been beggars and ghosts now stood in ranks, hardened by hunger and training. Their eyes still held pain, but behind it burned a steady light, the kind that only comes from survival. When Washington rode out before them, they cheered, not because the hardship had ended, but because they had endured it together. Valley Forge had not destroyed them, it had remade them. Out of misery came discipline, and out of despair, resolve. Washington emerged from that winter not with more soldiers, but with something far stronger: believers. They had learned that freedom was not a banner or a speech, but a test of endurance. The snow had nearly buried the revolution, but from beneath its frozen surface rose an army ready to rise again, cold, hungry, and unbreakable. His greatest enemy wasn't the British, it was doubt. By the spring after Valley Forge, the snow had melted, but the frost inside the army lingered. Hunger had turned to bitterness, and exhaustion into suspicion. Rumors swept through the camps like fever whispers that Congress had lost faith, that the generals bickered behind closed doors, that perhaps the war itself was doomed. Men deserted in the night, leaving their muskets leaning against half-built fences. It was not British bullets that threatened the revolution. That year it was the slow, invisible rot of disbelief. Washington felt it in the air, heavy as smoke. His officers were weary, their loyalty stretched thin by hunger, humiliation, and endless orders that led to no glory. The letters from Congress were cold, full of questions about his decisions and veiled doubts about his command. Some of his subordinates, once eager, now whispered that another general, perhaps Gates, the victor of Saratoga, might lead better. Washington read those whispers between the lines and said nothing. Silence, he knew, could be more powerful than protest. The mutiny began small, a group of soldiers refusing to drill, their pay months overdue. Washington rode out to face them himself. No guards, no ceremony, just one man and his horse before a line of starving men with loaded muskets. He looked into their faces, men who had suffered and bled for the dream he had asked them to believe in, and spoke quietly. "You have done all that duty and honor require," he said. "Now let us do all that humanity demands." The anger in their eyes softened. When he finished, they lowered their weapons. It was not fear that calmed them. It was faith, fragile, but still alive. Behind the scenes, his challenges deepened. Congress debated replacing him. Letters circulated accusing him of indecision, arrogance, even incompetence. Washington answered none of them. He had learned that leadership was not about defending one's pride but proving one's purpose. He continued his daily rituals, rising before dawn, inspecting the lines, writing to governors and merchants for supplies. The quiet persistence of his presence became its own kind of defiance. He would not be overthrown, because he would not be broken. Late one evening, an aide found him alone, staring at a candle guttering low on his desk. "I cannot command the winds," he murmured, "but I can adjust my sails." It was a confession and a creed. He understood now that authority could not be forced, it had to be earned, moment by moment, in the trust of those who followed him. The soldiers did not love him because he was flawless. They loved him because he stayed. When the army marched again that summer, it was leaner, quieter, harder. They no longer fought for glory or applause. They fought for the man who had refused to abandon them when hope had fled. Washington had conquered the one enemy that could have ended the revolution without a single-shot despair. And from that victory came a truth he would carry forever. Command was not a crown. It was a burden of belief, earned each day from those who chose to follow. While he fought the British, others plotted his downfall. The winter had barely lifted when Washington faced a new enemy, one that wore not red, but the colors of his own cause. In the taverns of Philadelphia and the corridors of Congress, whispers spread like wildfire. George Washington was unfit to lead. He had lost too many battles, some said. He lacked the brilliance of General Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga. The revolution, still fragile and uncertain, was now being torn apart not by muskets, but by ambition. The conspiracy began in letters, quiet. Venomous words passed between politicians and officers who fancied themselves patriots. "His Excellency is slow," one wrote. "Indecisive." They called it the Conway Cabal, after General Thomas Conway, a man whose vanity outweighed his loyalty. Behind Washington's back, they plotted to replace him with Gates, believing that victory at Saratoga had proven him the true savior of the Republic. Washington knew of the rumors long before they reached the newspapers. He read the letters in silence, his face a mask that betrayed nothing. His aides expected fury. They imagined him storming into Congress, demanding justice or resigning in disgust. But Washington did neither. He folded the papers carefully, set them aside, and returned to his duties as though nothing had changed. When friends urged him to strike back, he simply said, "My enemies take an interest in my conduct. I take none in theirs." That calm infuriated his critics because it robbed them of power. They could whisper, they could scheme, but they could not make him break. Still, the strain weighed on him. Each day he woke to the knowledge that the enemy across the ocean was not his only threat. His letters to Congress grew more restrained, his tone almost painfully polite. Yet behind the measured words, his disappointment was clear. He had fought for unity and now watched pride and politics threaten to tear the revolution apart. Even so, he never spoke a word against Gates, never lashed out in anger. He would let time, not temper, decide his worth. Then, as suddenly as it began, the conspiracy collapsed under its own arrogance. A drunken boast, a misplaced letter, a few loose tongues, and the plot was exposed. Congress, embarrassed, reaffirmed Washington's command. Gates, humiliated, apologized. Conway, wounded in a duel, wrote the general a letter of regret, saying, "You are a great and good man." Washington's reply was as sharp as it was restrained. "I accept your apology. I wish you a speedy recovery." He never spoke of the affair again, but among the officers, his silence echoed louder than any victory. They saw in him something rarer than triumph self-control in the face of betrayal. It was not cannon fire or courage that saved his command that winter, but character. Washington had proven that leadership was not measured by how one wins a war, but how one carries its weight. And with dignity instead of rage, he silenced his enemies without firing a single shot. In blistering heat, he finally found his fire. The summer of 1778 blazed over the fields of New Jersey, turning the ground to dust and the air to fire. The British were retreating from Philadelphia, their columns stretching for miles, their red coats flashing in the sun. For the first time since the dark winter at Valley Forge, Washington's army stood ready to meet them in open battle, trained, disciplined, and hungry, to prove that the long months of suffering had not been in vain. The Revolution's fate, once hanging by a thread, was now carried on the march toward Monmouth. The plan was simple: strike the British rear as they moved across the countryside. Washington entrusted the attack to General Charles Lee, a man more ambitious than loyal. Lee had long resented Washington's command and saw himself as the better strategist. But when the fighting began on June 28th, chaos followed. The British counterattacked, and Lee's forces broke. Smoke and confusion swallowed the fields as soldiers retreated in panic. Word reached Washington that his vanguard was fleeing, and his fury ignited like powder. He galloped forward through the heat, his horse slick with sweat, his officers racing behind. When he found Lee's troops streaming backward through the haze, Washington's voice thundered across the field. "What is the meaning of this retreat?" he roared. Lee stammered excuses, miscommunication, confusion, but Washington would hear none of it. Witnesses said his anger that day could have melted iron. Without hesitation, he seized command on the spot, rallying the men with sheer force of will. "Face about!" he shouted. "Face the enemy!" And they did. Under his orders, the retreat turned into resistance. Washington rode along the front lines, bullets whistling past, calling out to the men by name. "Stand fast, my lads. Stand and give them fire." His horse reared, his sword flashed, and the sight of him in the smoke became the anchor that steadied the chaos. Soldiers who had wavered moments earlier now fired with precision, their training from Valley Forge coming alive in the blaze of battle. The British, shocked by the sudden resistance, began to falter. The fight raged for hours under a merciless sun. Men dropped from exhaustion, their canteens empty, their throats raw from thirst. The air shimmered with heat and gunpowder, but neither side broke. As night fell, the British slipped away under cover of darkness, not defeated, but denied victory. Washington stood among his men, his face streaked with dust and sweat, the fire of battle still in his eyes. Monmouth was no clear triumph, but it was no defeat either. For the first time, the Continental Army had gone toe-to-toe with Britain's finest and had not flinched. When the guns fell silent, Washington looked across the field at the men who had once been starving ghosts at Valley Forge. They had become soldiers, steady, disciplined, unyielding. It was not the scale of the battle that mattered, but the transformation it revealed. America had learned to fight not with desperation, but with defiance. The Empire had met its match in endurance. In the blistering heat of Monmouth, Washington did not just find his victory, he found his army. The hero who burned for glory turned traitor for gold. By 1780, the Revolution had endured 5 long years of blood and sacrifice. Its victories had been rare, its hardships endless, and among its heroes, none shone brighter than Benedict Arnold, the fearless warrior who had bled for the cause at Saratoga, the man Washington himself had called brave and brilliant. But glory, for Arnold, was never enough. Beneath the medals and scars, ambition smouldered, and when honor could no longer feed it, betrayal did. Arnold had grown bitter, wounded in battle, passed over for promotion, accused of corruption by men he saw as lesser. He convinced himself that his genius had been repaid with ingratitude. Even Washington's trust, generous and unwavering, began to feel like insult rather than respect. "A man of my merit," Arnold once wrote, "should not be treated like a common officer." Pride became poison, and in that poison, treason found its root. From his new command at West Point, Arnold began secret correspondence with the enemy. Through coded letters and invisible ink, he plotted to surrender the fortress and the Hudson River with it to the British. The price was £20,000 in gold and a general's commission. To deliver his offer, a British spy named Major John Andre rode under false identity to meet him. It was a perfect plan, until it wasn't. Andre was caught behind American lines, papers hidden in his boot, the proof of betrayal laid bare. When word reached Washington, he was on his way to inspect West Point the very day Arnold was preparing to hand it over. An aide galloped up with the captured documents, his face ashen. Washington read the letters in silence, the air around him growing heavier with every line. "Arnold has betrayed us," he said at last, his voice flat, his eyes distant. For the first time, those who served him saw something they had never seen before: heartbreak. Arnold escaped to a British ship before Washington could reach him. André, the messenger, was hanged as a spy, dignified, calm, and mourned even by his enemies. But Arnold lived on, cursed by his own name. To Washington, the pain was not in the treason itself, but in the trust broken. He had believed in Arnold, defended him, promoted him, called him friend. Now, the man who had once charged into battle beneath the American flag was plotting the destruction of everything they had fought to build. In the stillness after the discovery, Washington wrote to his officers, "Whom can we trust now?" It was not anger that filled his words, but sorrow. He had learned that betrayal did not come from enemies, it came from those who once stood beside you. The revolution had survived famine, disease, and defeat, but this wound was different. It was a reminder that even victory can rot from within, that freedom's enemies sometimes wear familiar faces. And in that moment, Washington's faith in men faltered, but his faith in the cause did not. He realized the way to win was not to win at all. By 1780, the revolution had become less a war of battle than a war of endurance. The lightning strikes and daring gambles that once defined Washington's campaigns had faded into weary routine. Armies marched, fought, withdrew, and bled for ground that changed nothing. The British held the cities, the Americans the wilderness, and in between stretched a no-man's land of smoke, ruin, and despair. The dream of swift victory had long since burned away. Now the only question was which side would last longer. Washington had learned bitterly that glory was the enemy of survival. Every time he had met the British in open battle, their discipline and firepower had left his army broken. But when he avoided them, when he retreated, regrouped, and struck only when the odds turned, then he endured. It was not the way of heroes, but of survivors. "We must act the fox as well as the lion," he once said. His army would not conquer through conquest, but through patience, a weapon the British neither understood nor respected. The years dragged on. His men were unpaid, underfed, and forgotten by the politicians who bickered in Philadelphia. Congress was bankrupt, its members quarreling over power while soldiers shivered in the mud. Washington's letters grew colder, his tone sharper. "We are at the end of our tether," he warned. Yet in public, he remained unshaken. To his men, he was the same unmovable figure riding through the camps, offering words of steadiness when he himself felt hollow. He could not promise them victory, but he could promise them purpose. Sometimes he wondered if that was enough. There were nights when he stood alone outside his tent, listening to the wind sweep over the empty fields, wondering if history would remember him as a savior or a failure. But still, each morning, he rose and led. His greatness was not in daring, but in discipline, in refusing to surrender, even when surrender might have seemed merciful. He fought not to win battles, but to prevent defeat. He had turned survival itself into strategy. The British, for all their power, grew weary. Each victory they won seemed hollow, another town burned, another winter wasted. Washington's refusal to be destroyed began to drain them as surely as cannon fire. They could defeat his army, but never his will. In time, the world began to see what the British could not, that endurance itself was victory. By the war's 6th year, the revolution no longer belonged to those who sought glory. It belonged to those who could still stand after the world had tried to break them. Washington had become not a general of conquest, but of time waging a slow, grinding war that tested the soul of a nation. And when history finally turned in his favor, it would be because he never stopped enduring. Patience had become his greatest weapon, and time the cruelest of all enemies, his closest ally. He learned that lies could save a nation. By 1780, Washington had come to understand that the revolution could not be won by force alone. His army was too small, his resources too thin, and the enemy too strong. but knowledge that was a weapon he could wield. The British ruled the cities and the seas, but Washington began to rule something else: the shadows. From a web of couriers, merchants, and ordinary citizens, he built the most elusive weapon of the war, a network of spies who could move through the enemy unseen. In New York, now under British occupation, the heart of this invisible army began to beat. The culper-spiring farmers, shopkeepers, and tavern keepers risked everything to pass secrets hidden in laundry lines, coded letters, and invisible ink. At their centre stood men like Abraham Woodhull and Robert Townsend, who lived double lives as loyal subjects by day and patriots by night. Their words, smuggled across Long Island Sound by the daring sailor Caleb Brewster, reached Washington in ciphered form. He studied each message like scripture, tracing the war's truth between lines of ink. The general who had once charged into musket fire now fought his battles in silence. He mastered deception, learning to feed false intelligence to the British while protecting his real plans with layers of lies. He wrote in code names and numbers: Agent 355, Samuel Culper, 711. To his officers, it was an entirely new kind of warfare, one waged with whispers instead of gunpowder. Yet Washington understood that the power of illusion could move armies. A rumor well placed could save more lives than a regiment well led. When one of his letters was intercepted, he laughed quietly to himself. Even if read, it would tell the enemy nothing. His cipher was unbreakable, his invisible ink undetectable. Behind every skirmish and siege now moved an unseen current of intelligence, reports of troop movements, intercepted messages, details of supplies and plans. It was through this shadow network that Washington learned of Benedict Arnold's treachery, that he foiled raids, that he shaped the British perception of his strength. The general who had once been blindsided in New York was now seeing farther than his enemy ever could. Yet his spies were not soldiers. They received no medals, no fanfare, no promise of safety. Many of their names were lost to time, their sacrifices buried in silence. Washington never forgot them. He wrote in one letter, "There is nothing more necessary than good intelligence, and no one deserves greater reward." He knew that history would forget them, as it often did those who worked in the dark, but he never did. The art of deception had become the general's greatest truth. By learning to manipulate shadows, Washington ensured the revolution's light would survive. His mastery of intelligence, his quiet, calculating brilliance, marked not only the turning point of the war, but the birth of modern espionage itself. He had learned to lead not only by sword and strategy, but by silence, and from that silence, the fate of a nation was rewritten. He had one last gamble left and everything to lose. By 1781, the revolution was a candle, burning low. The war had dragged on for 6 years, each victory paid for with hunger, doubt, and loss. Washington's army was threadbare, his treasury empty, and his patience worn thin. Yet far to the south, a chance had appeared. British General Charles Cornwallis had entrenched his forces at a place called Yorktown, by the banks of the Chesapeake. It was a mistake Washington meant to turn into salvation. For months, he had begged France for more than sympathy. Now, at last, ships and soldiers had come. The Comte de Rochambeau and the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse offered Washington what he had never truly possessed the power to strike. Still, the risk was staggering. To march the Continental Army hundreds of miles south, leaving New York in British hands, meant staking the revolution on a single throw of the dice. Washington knew that if he failed here, the dream of independence would die not in battle, but in exhaustion. He kept his true intentions secret even from his own men. Rumors spread that they were preparing to attack New York, but the columns turned south instead, their boots grinding through dust and heat. It was a march of faith, thousands of weary soldiers following their general on the promise that this time it would end differently. At night, Washington rode alone, studying the horizon, his thoughts heavy with fear. He could not show it, not even to his closest aides. Hope, he knew, must be performed before it could be believed. By early autumn, the trap began to close. The French fleet sealed off the Chesapeake, cutting Cornwallis off from escape or reinforcement. Washington and Rochambeau's armies arrived by land, surrounding Yorktown in a tightening ring of fire. The British guns thundered from the ridges, but this time it was the Americans who advanced calm, precise, relentless. When Washington gave the order to open fire, the ground itself seemed to shake. For days, the siege roared like a storm, cannon smoke blotting out the sun. In the trenches, soldiers dug and fought by torchlight. French and American flags fluttered side by side. Washington moved through the lines at night, his face illuminated by the glow of burning powder. He had seen defeat so many times that victory now felt like a dangerous dream. On October 19th, Cornwallis surrendered. The war was not yet formally over, but the struggle was. The British marched out in silence, their drums muffled, their empire humbled. As the guns fell quiet, Washington stood apart from the celebration. He removed his hat, bowed his head, and said softly, "The work is done, and it is marvelous in our eyes." It was not triumph he felt, but relief, a release from 6 years of doubt and desperation. For the first time, victory felt real. The general who had led an army through defeat after defeat had found the one thing he had never dared to expect, an ending. And in that fragile, glorious moment at Yorktown, the impossible finally became a nation. When the guns fell silent, he could barely believe it. The siege of Yorktown had ended in thunder, the roar of cannon, the crack of musket fire, the cries of men breaking under the weight of history. For weeks, Washington had lived among the trenches and smoke, commanding by instinct more than hope. Now, as the last echo of gunfire faded across the river, he stood still, listening to the one sound he had not heard in years: peace. It was almost unbearable in its quiet. The battlefield was a ruin of splintered earth and twisted iron. The air smelled of smoke and wet soil, of triumph and death. Cornwallis had surrendered. His army, the pride of Britain, had marched out with colours lowered and drums muffled, laying their weapons down before Washington's men. Soldiers who had once fought barefoot in the snow now stood straight and silent, their ragged uniforms no less proud than the finest British red. Some wept openly. Others stared in disbelief. Freedom, it seemed, had arrived, but no one yet knew what it would cost. Washington rode slowly through the aftermath, past the shattered redoubts and abandoned cannon. His officers cheered him, but he raised a hand for silence. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times the end of the war, the victory long denied, yet it did not feel like triumph. It felt like survival. 6 years of hunger, failure, and faith had led to this one fragile instant. A single misstep, one more defeat, and all of it would have vanished into the sea like mist. That night, the campfires along the river burned brighter than stars. The soldiers sang, drank, and dreamed of home. Washington sat apart, writing by candlelight. "The scene is closed," he wrote, his pen trembling slightly. "The curtain may drop when it will." But even in victory, he could not rest. His thoughts turned to the army, still unpaid, to the Congress divided by ego and fear, to the fragile new country that might yet tear itself apart before it could stand. Yorktown had ended the fighting, but not the struggle. The next morning, he walked the lines at dawn. The mist hung low over the fields, the sound of the river soft and steady. He stopped to speak to a young sentry, a boy barely 16, his musket taller than he was. The lad asked if the war was truly over. Washington looked at him for a long moment before answering. "No," he said quietly. "Only this part of it." His victory was less triumph than release a breath drawn after years of drowning. The revolution had survived by the thinnest thread of endurance, stretched but never broken. And as Washington gazed toward the rising sun over Yorktown, he understood the truth that history would forget. That freedom was not born in that silence, but in every moment before it, in the defeats endured, the faith unshaken, and the will that refused to die. The war had ended, but the nation had only just begun. After victory, they offered him a crown, and he refused it. The war was over, but peace proved more dangerous than battle. The army sat restless in its camps, unpaid, unrecognized, and forgotten by the Congress they had fought to protect. Rumors spread like wildfire through the ranks that the revolution had betrayed its own soldiers, that liberty had only traded one kind of tyranny for another. Some whispered that there was only one man strong enough to save the new nation from chaos. His name was George Washington. It began as murmurs, "Why not make him king?" spoken first in jest, then in earnest. The people adored him, the army worshipped him, and even his enemies admired him. Washington could have taken power easily. The country would have followed him without hesitation. He had the army, the loyalty, and the myth. But he also carried something heavier than ambition, the memory of what they had fought for. He had not led men through starvation and death, just to become the very thing they had destroyed. In the winter of 1783, discontent reached its peak at Newburgh, New York. Officers gathered in secret, furious over unpaid wages and broken promises. Some proposed marching on Congress itself, a military coup to seize the government and restore order under Washington's name. When he learned of the plot, he did not send threats or soldiers. Instead, he asked to speak to them. On a cold March morning, he entered the hall where the men had assembled, their faces hard, their patience gone. He said little at first. He praised their service, acknowledged their suffering, and then reached into his coat for a letter from Congress. As he unfolded it, his hand trembled. "Gentlemen," he said, pulling a pair of spectacles from his pocket, "you must pardon me. I have grown grey in your service, and now find myself growing blind." The room fell silent. Some men turned away, ashamed. Others wept. In that small human moment, not of command, but of humility, the rebellion within the revolution ended. The officers laid down their anger and pledged once more to the republic they had built together. Months later, when the British had departed and the last soldiers went home, Washington faced his final decision. He could have remained in power commander for life, ruler in all but name. Instead, on a quiet December day, he resigned his commission before Congress. His speech was brief and solemn. "Having now finished the work assigned me," he said, "I retire from the great theatre of action." Then he bowed, turned, and walked out of the room, a private man once more. The world watched in disbelief. Kings conquered nations only to rule them. Generals seized power in victory as naturally as breathing. But Washington walked away. He became not a monarch, but something far rarer, a citizen. In the silence after his resignation, the world glimpsed the true meaning of revolution. Not power taken, but power given back. And in that act, George Washington did what no conqueror ever could. He built a republic that would outlive him. He became immortal not because he won, but because he didn't give up. History remembers George Washington as the man who could not fail, the marble statue in the mind of a nation. But the truth is far more human and far more powerful. He stumbled. He doubted. He lost more battles than he won. Yet through every defeat, through every frozen march and hollow victory, he refused to let the cause die. It was not triumph that defined him, but endurance. From the chaos of New York to the misery of Valley Forge, from betrayal to mutiny, Washington's greatness was not born of genius, but of grit. He did not inspire men because he was flawless, but because he shared their fear and still stood tall. In moments when all seemed lost, he became the steady flame that would not flicker. Even when despair pressed hardest, he carried himself with a dignity that reminded his soldiers, and perhaps himself, that the revolution was worth suffering for. He was never the boldest strategist, nor the most gifted tactician. His plans failed as often as they succeeded, but every loss taught him patience, every mistake hardened his resolve. He learned that winning the war did not mean destroying the enemy, it meant surviving them. He turned retreat into strategy, endurance into victory. Through his own near collapse, he discovered what kind of leader the revolution truly needed, not a conqueror, but a guardian. When the British finally surrendered at Yorktown, it was not the triumph of a man who had mastered war, it was the vindication of one who had mastered himself. Washington's restraint, his silence in the face of betrayal, his refusal to seize power when offered a crown, these were the victories that mattered. In a world that worshipped kings and conquest, he proved that true strength lay not in control, but in character. Years later, when he left the presidency and walked back into private life, he did so the same way he had led an army quietly, humbly, without spectacle. The republic he had nearly lost was now a nation, fragile and free. Others would build its laws, expand its borders, and test its ideals, but none would ever again hold its soul the way he had by almost losing it. America was not born from perfection, but perseverance. It rose from retreats, from hunger, from doubt. It was forged by a man who learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. Washington's near failures became its foundation, his humanity, its inheritance. He taught a fledgling nation that endurance itself could be victory, and that sometimes the greatest hero is the one who simply refuses to fall.